He was just a single dad trying to make it through another cold New York afternoon delivering packages and keeping his head down. But when a group of lost tourists panicked in the middle of Bryant Park, he stepped in and spoke 8 different languages like second nature. What he didn't know was who had been watching. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about quiet heroes, second chances, and the power of kindness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's begin. Single dad helped a lost tourist group by speaking 8 languages. He didn't know. The woman was a CEO. Luca Rivera tightened the strap of his delivery bag as the freezing wind of Midtown Manhattan whipped against his jacket. It was barely 4:00 p.m., but the December sky was already slipping into a dull gray. He checked his watch 15 minutes to get across 4 blocks and 2 avenues. If he timed it right, he could catch the last train back to the Bronx before rush hour strangled the city. Emily hated when he was late. Not that she ever complained, she was too thoughtful for that. But he could always see it in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged just a little, the way she quietly ate dinner and said, "It's okay, Dad. I know you're busy." He picked up his pace, weaving through crowds and traffic until a strange commotion near Bryant Park caught his ear, a jumble of voices overlapping in confusion. Tourists, probably. Another Christmas group lost between 5th and Madison. He should have kept walking, but something made him stop. About 10 people were huddled near a lamppost, all bundled in heavy coats, some waving maps, others frantically pointing at their phones. A woman with a stroller was nearly in tears. 2 elderly men were arguing, one in German, the other in Mandarin. And at the center of it all stood a flustered young guide in a blue jacket holding a useless sign that read NYC Walking Tour. Multilingual available. The poor guy clearly didn't speak any of them. Luca hesitated. Time was tight. But as he watched the group fall further into panic, something in him, something deeply wired, clicked. He stepped forward. "Se han perdido?" he asked, gently directing the question to the elderly couple who looked the most frazzled. Their eyes lit up. Spanish. Sí, no encontramos la calle. He nodded, calming them with a smile. Está bien, les ayudaré. Turning to the German man, Luca switched tongues. Brauchen Sie Hilfe? The man blinked, startled. Ja bitte, then came the Mandarin. Luca bowed slightly and spoke slowly, respectfully. Nin mi lu liao ma wo ke bang mang gasps. Heads turned. A younger woman laughed in relief and clapped her hands. A child tugged on her mother's coat and whispered, "Mommy, he's like a wizard." In less than 5 minutes, Luca had navigated the linguistic maze, translating directions, calming nerves, even helping a few tourists call their hotels. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket and sketched out a simplified city grid on the back of a flyer, labeling it in 4 languages. When the group finally dispersed, grateful and smiling, it was like watching a human storm dissolve into light. He exhaled already, running calculations in his head. He'd miss the train. Emily would be waiting. He turned to go, only to find someone still standing beneath the lamppost. A woman. Tall, elegant, wrapped in a navy wool coat with gold buttons. A soft cashmere scarf framed her face and oversized sunglasses hid her eyes, even though the sun had long disappeared. She hadn't said a word the entire time, but now she stepped forward. That was remarkable, she said in flawless English, her voice calm but undeniably impressed. Luca froze. Something about her presence commanded attention, but it wasn't loud. It was composed precise, like the silence between 2 perfect piano notes. He offered a humble shrug. "I just happened to know the right words." She tilted her head. "Most people barely know 1 language. You just spoke, 5/8?" He admitted, then instantly regretted it. He hadn't meant to boast. 8, she repeated almost to herself. "And you're a delivery driver." He nodded, among other things. She studied him. "What's your name?" He hesitated again, wary of sounding evasive. "Luca." She extended a hand encased in a thin leather glove. "Clara." They shook. Her grip was firm but not overbearing. "Well, Luca," she said, taking a half-step back. That was the most impressive thing I've seen all week, possibly all year. Before he could reply, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A driver stepped out and opened the door without a word. Of course, she was someone. He should have known. The coat alone probably cost more than his rent. Clara paused half in the car, then turned. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people just walk past." "I almost did," Luca replied. She smiled just barely and got in. The door closed and the car melted into the traffic like it had never been there. Luca stood still for a beat longer, the cold forgotten. Then he shook himself back into reality. He was late. Again. He made it home just before 6. Emily was curled up on the couch reading an old illustrated copy of The Little Prince. The moment she saw him, she beamed. "Sorry," he said, setting the bag down. "Got caught up helping some tourists." She grinned. "Did you use all your magic words again?" He chuckled. "Some of them." They had macaroni and cheese for dinner. Emily told him about a new friend at school named Zara who also liked drawing galaxies. Luca listened intently, laughing where she needed him to, nodding where she was serious. She didn't ask why he was late tonight. She just leaned her head on his shoulder after the dishes were done and whispered, "I like when you help people." He looked down at her, his heart tightening in that way it always did. Me too. But as he stared out the window at the darkening skyline, his thoughts drifted back to the woman in navy blue, and the strange sense that somehow that moment had meant something more than just another good deed. Something had shifted, and deep inside in the place he usually kept locked away, a voice stirred one he hadn't used in a long, long time. Not a language. Something older. Hope. The penthouse office of Clara Moreau didn't reflect the usual corporate chaos of downtown Manhattan. Instead, it was carved in quiet elegance glass walls overlooking the skyline, minimalist furniture, a single bonsai tree thriving on the corner of her desk. Everything was curated, efficient, disciplined. Just like her. Except for today. She was sitting at her desk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the security footage playing silently on her monitor, a grainy clip from Bryant Park. The image had been zoomed in, stabilized, and looped. It showed a man, perhaps mid-30s, with wind-blown hair and a threadbare coat, calmly orchestrating order from chaos. One by one, the tourists had lit up like candles in his presence. She pressed pause. The image froze on his face, warm but reserved, like someone used to standing behind others, not ahead of them. And his voice, well, she didn't have that on video, but she remembered it. Measured, assured. And each word in every language spoken with a grace she rarely encountered even in professional interpreters. "What do you want me to do with this guy?" asked Jules, her assistant, standing just inside the doorway. Clara didn't look away from the screen. "Find him." Jules scoffed lightly. "You do realize how many delivery men there are in Manhattan? I'm not asking for his social security number. Just a name, maybe a shift schedule." "I spoke to him. He said his name was Luca." Jules tapped his tablet, unconvinced. "No last name company." He didn't say, but he was wearing a badge. I think it said Courier Express. She paused, recalling more. He had a sticker on his bag, a child's drawing, maybe. It looked like a rocket. Jules scribbled a note. "So, we're looking for a multilingual mystery man with a daughter who likes rockets." Clara allowed a rare, fleeting smile. "Exactly." Jules sighed, though his expression softened. "Okay, I'll do my best." He left, and the office returned to silence. Clara leaned back in her chair, arms still folded. The day should have been about her quarterly presentation. Instead, she'd barely glanced at the numbers, and that wasn't like her. She was Clara Moreau, daughter of diplomats, CEO of Moreau Global Technologies, a woman who negotiated billion-dollar deals while chewing on stale airplane crackers at 35,000 feet. She had been called fierce, cold, brilliant, unstoppable. All of it true. All of it earned. But none of that had prepared her for what she felt when she watched Luca. He hadn't tried to impress anyone. He hadn't even seemed aware that what he was doing was remarkable. He simply helped because someone needed it. No transaction. No agenda. She remembered his words, "I just happened to know the right words." That humility unsettled her more than she cared to admit. It reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years, not since before the boardroom the investor battles the scandal with Roman Greaves that nearly cost her the company. She'd spent so long surviving the wolves that she forgot what it felt like to be human. Her mind wandered back to the last few minutes of that afternoon, the moment before she stepped into the car when she turned and saw Luca watching the disappearing group like someone who always left before he was seen. She had been seen too much, he not enough. The contrast haunted her. Meanwhile, in a two-room apartment in the Bronx, Luca sat at the kitchen table sorting bills. The glow from a single ceiling bulb cast long shadows across the faded tile floor. Emily had fallen asleep, curled up beside her sketchbook on the couch. Her latest drawing was a space station with a smiling moon and the words, "Dad." Commander Luca, scribbled in purple crayon. Luca smiled and tucked a blanket over her. Then he returned to the table and flipped over the latest envelope hospital payment due. Emily's next respiratory therapy appointment wasn't covered by Medicaid. Again. He didn't complain. He hadn't for years. Not since Megan died. Instead, he looked at the flyer still in his coat pocket, the one he'd scribbled directions on for the tourists. His mind drifted back to the woman in the navy coat. Her poise. Her eyes, which he could barely see but somehow still felt. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't needed to. But she had stayed. He didn't know why that mattered. 2 days passed. On Thursday morning, Clara's phone buzzed during a leadership meeting. She never looked at messages during presentations, ever. But this time she did. Jules Courier Express. Name's Luca Rivera. Bronx address. No social media. Used to teach languages at Hunter College. Tenured. Resigned 6 years ago. No known misconduct. Divorced. 1 child. That's all I got. Want me to stop? She stared at the message for a long time, then typed one word, "No." After the meeting, she stepped outside and stood by the windows overlooking the river. Her mind was racing not in panic, but in decision. She now had a name, a profession, and a past, and none of it made sense. Why would a tenured linguistics professor give it all up to deliver packages unless something or someone had broken him? She remembered how gently he spoke to that elderly woman, the way he crouched down to the child's level without a trace of condescension. She had spent years commanding rooms full of men who never once looked another human being in the eye when they didn't have to. And yet Luca had done it instinctively. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This was about something else, something stirring in her that had been silent for far too long. A voice, not a language, but a call. She turned her reflection catching in the window, a woman always in control now moved by a man who didn't even try to control anything, who simply was. Clara straightened her collar, took a breath, and said aloud, "I need to meet him again." Not as a CEO, not even as a stranger, but as a woman who for once in her life didn't want to be saved, only understood. The sky above the Bronx was the color of old steel by the time Luca stepped off the 6 train and began his usual walk home. The sidewalks here were cracked and uneven but familiar, comforting even. This was a neighborhood that didn't ask questions, didn't pretend to care unless you earned it. Luca didn't mind. He liked the quiet anonymity. He pushed open the metal gate to the worn, red brick building, took the stairs 2 at a time, and entered the apartment he and Emily had called home for nearly 6 years. The air smelled faintly of laundry soap and pencil shavings, a combination he found strangely soothing. He dropped his bag and called out. "M." In the kitchen, he smiled. Emily stood on a step stool in her galaxy pajamas, stirring hot chocolate with the precision of a scientist launching a satellite. A row of marshmallows had been aligned on the counter like planets. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "I bribed the subway," Luca replied, pulling off his coat. "Told them I spoke fluent train." She grinned at the joke. "Did they ask for proof? I gave them my Metro card." They were very impressed. They shared a laugh, and for a moment the weight of everything else dropped away. But it returned later that night when Emily was asleep and the apartment was still. Luca sat on the edge of the couch, an envelope in his hand, one of those pale blue ones with hospital logos that always made his stomach tighten. Inside, another denial. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. This was the third appeal rejected in 2 months. Without the supplemental oxygen therapy, Emily's condition would only get harder to manage. The last time her breathing had spiked during the night, he hadn't slept for 3 days straight, afraid to even close his eyes. Once, long ago, he could have handled this, back when he was Professor Rivera, before everything shattered. He opened a drawer, pulled out a weathered file marked Hunter College, termination appeal, and stared at it. No misconduct, no scandal, just absence. When Megan was diagnosed, he had asked for a semester of leave. They gave it. When she declined faster than anyone expected, he asked for another. That one came with conditions. And when Emily was born, 2 months premature, just days after her mother died, Luca stopped asking. He handed in his resignation the same week he learned to sterilize feeding tubes. People had told him he was brave, or foolish, or selfless. They didn't see him during the months when Emily cried without sound and he rocked her until his arms gave out. They didn't see the bills pile up or the job applications he sent never mentioning the PhD because he was too qualified to stock shelves and too broke to wait for better. Eventually, he stopped talking about what he used to do, and no one asked, until now. Downtown, Clara stood inside a modest neighborhood cafe just off the Grand Concourse. The next morning had come quickly and she wore jeans, a black sweater, and her hair tied back less CEO, more local librarian. She'd done her research. The delivery manifest from Courier Express showed Luca's route began near this cafe every Thursday. She had no plan beyond seeing him again. The bell above the door jingled and she turned. He walked in wearing the same coat from Bryant Park, only this time with a thermos tucked under one arm and earbuds in. He looked tired but calm, moving with quiet purpose. He didn't see her, not right away. She watched him order a black coffee, thank the barista in what sounded like Haitian Creole, and move toward the corner table. That's when their eyes met. He froze. She stood, slowly giving him a choice, acknowledge her, or walk away. He didn't walk. "Clara," he said, uncertain but polite. "I'm glad you remember," she replied. "I don't think I'll forget someone who watched me juggle 8 languages under pressure." She smiled. "You made it look effortless." He motioned for her to sit. They settled across from one another, separated by a steaming paper cup and the soft hum of morning chatter. "I hope this isn't weird," she said, folding her hands. "I just wanted to thank you again." "Properly. You already did." "Well, this time I wanted to buy you a coffee," she said, then paused. "And also ask a favor." Luca tilted his head slightly. "What kind of favor?" "A translation. A big one. High stakes." He raised a brow but said nothing. She leaned forward. "My company is hosting a cross-continental summit next week. Investors, partners, press. Multiple languages. We need someone who can handle sensitive communication. I don't trust just anyone." "I'm not certified anymore," he said quietly. "I left that world a long time ago." "I know. I did some digging." She didn't say it with judgment, only honesty. "Then you know why I left?" he replied. She nodded. "I also know you were one of the most respected multilingual educators in the tri-state area. Your students wrote testimonials that made my assistant cry." Luca allowed a breath of dry amusement. "That's quite a resume. You helped 10 strangers in 5 minutes without expecting anything in return," she said. "I think that counts for something." He looked out the window. The street bustled with movement, but in the glass he saw his own reflection. Tired eyes, a jaw, always half-clenched with restraint, a man who used to believe in big things. "You really want me," he said at last, "to stand in a room full of billionaires and translate for people who've never thought twice about men like me." "I want someone I can trust," Clara said, "and someone who knows how to listen. You listen differently, not just to words, to people." He turned back to her, stunned by the truth in that. Then he asked the one question she didn't expect. "What's in it for you?" Clara blinked, then leaned back, hands open. "I'm tired," she said simply, "of people doing everything for gain, of hiring sharks who'll turn on me the minute I show a crack. I needed a reminder that integrity still exists, that decency matters." A long silence. Then Luca reached for his thermos and stood. "I'll think about it," he said. As he passed, Clara called after him, "Luca." He paused. "I think the world would be a better place if more people heard your voice." He didn't reply, but he didn't stop smiling for the rest of the day. Luca hadn't meant to say yes. In fact, by the time he boarded the train back to the Bronx that evening, he'd planned on drafting a polite message to Clara, thanking her for the opportunity and respectfully declining. He had enough going on. Emily had another doctor's appointment in 3 days, his delivery shifts were already being juggled to accommodate her school drop-offs, and most of all, he didn't trust the corporate world. It chewed people up. He'd seen it do that to Megan's brother, and Megan, and himself. Still, that night long after Emily had fallen asleep snuggled under a blanket of stars she'd drawn on printer paper and taped to the wall, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and the cursor blinking on a blank email. He stared at it, then closed the laptop. The next morning, before he could second-guess himself, he opened a new tab and began typing. To Clara.mcgo@global.com. Subject, thank you, and a thought. Clara, thank you again for the offer. I've thought about it carefully. I'd like to accept the temporary role for the summit next week with the understanding that I return to my regular work afterward. My daughter's health and schedule are my first priority. I'll need flexibility, and I'd prefer to avoid any form of public announcement. I'm not looking for recognition. I'm just looking to help. Luca Rivera. He hit send. It took exactly 36 seconds for her reply to arrive. Subject thank you, and a thought. Luca. That's the best email I've received in 5 years. We'll make it work. No spotlight, no speeches, just truth and clarity. I'll have my team reach out with logistics by the end of the day. Welcome aboard, Clara. By Monday, he was sitting in a conference room high above Park Avenue surrounded by glass silence and the quiet pressure of power. He wore a blazer that hadn't seen the light of day since Megan's memorial and a pair of shoes that felt far too stiff for a man used to walking fast and bending low. But what unnerved him most wasn't the setting. It was how natural it all felt. He'd been away from this world for so long he forgot what it was like to be needed for more than his ability to carry boxes or show up on time. Here, every glance was curious. Every nod was a silent question. Who is this man? And why is Clara walking beside him? Clara introduced him simply as our cross-cultural consultant. She said it with such effortless authority that no one dared press further. Still, eyes followed him. They always followed Clara. She was different now, he noticed. Looser, but no less sharp. She smiled more easily, though the steel in her spine hadn't dulled. She briefed him between meetings explaining investor preferences, cultural nuances, even personal tensions between certain stakeholders. Her attention to detail was surgical, but not controlling. She trusted him to handle it. By Wednesday, they had rehearsed 3 language-switching sequences, created custom note cards for emergencies, and walked through a dozen potential scenarios for Q&As. Luca knew 4 of the languages fluently. The other 3 came back quickly. What surprised him most was how much he enjoyed it. Late one evening, after a final run-through, Clara offered to drive him home. "I can take the train," he said, hesitant. "I've already made the offer," she replied, unlocking her car. The drive was quiet at first. New York blurred past the windows lit up hungry alive. Then, as they crossed the Harlem River, Clara asked, "Do you ever miss it?" He glanced at her. "The university." She nodded. He paused. "Some days, but I don't miss what it became, or what it cost. And what about what you became? That one landed harder than he expected." "I became a father," he said simply. "Everything else is optional." She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, My father once told me being a parent is the highest form of translation. You take the chaos of life and interpret it for someone small and scared. Luca looked at her again, truly seeing her now. The weight in her voice wasn't theoretical. "You were close to him?" he asked. "I thought so," she said, "until I took over his company and realized he'd been grooming me, not trusting me." Luca let that settle. Trust isn't taught. It's chosen. They didn't speak again until she pulled up near his building. As he opened the door to get out, she said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me how leadership is supposed to feel." He nodded once, then stepped into the cold. Back upstairs, Luca checked on Emily, who was asleep in her spaceship pajamas, mouth slightly open, inhaler beside her like a teddy bear. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "It's going to be okay." Then he stood by the window looking out across the rooftops. A week ago, he was invisible. Now he was translating again. Not just worlds. And the most remarkable part wasn't that Clara had brought him back into that space. It was that she never once tried to change him. She let him arrive as he was and made space for his voice. Not louder, just clearer. And for the first time in years, Luca Rivera didn't feel like a man trying to rebuild his past. He felt like a man finally stepping into his future. The double doors of the conference hall whispered open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a space awash in modern elegance. High ceilings curved like cathedral arches overhead. The walls gleamed with warm, amber lighting, while rows of chairs fanned out like ripples in still water. Screens lined the front of the stage, already flashing the Moreau Global Technology Summit logo in 6 languages. It was the kind of room built for power to speak and for the world to listen. Luca stood at the edge of it in a dark tailored suit Clara's assistant had arranged for him. It fit better than he wanted to admit. He adjusted the slim, wireless earpiece in his left ear and ran a mental diagnostic through the languages he might need today: French, Mandarin, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Japanese. English was the only one he wasn't worried about, though. Ironically, it was also the one most often abused in corporate settings. Behind him, Clara approached, dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit sharp enough to draw blood, her hair pinned with precision, but her eyes softer than the image projected on the massive welcome banners outside. "You okay?" she asked. "Ask me again in 3 hours." She gave a small smile. "You've done harder things. You once negotiated directions to a falafel cart in 8 languages at a street corner. That was easier. The falafel had a map. Today, she said gently, you're the map." Luca inhaled. Let it anchor him. The morning began like clockwork. Executives, investors, and global partners filtered in, murmuring pleasantries in multiple dialects. Clara introduced speakers with smooth authority. When subtle misunderstandings cropped up, nuances lost in translation hesitations that could skew meaning, Luca stepped in like a shadow with light. He moved from whisper to ear to live floor translation, seamlessly bridging cultural gaps with quiet command. In Mandarin, he clarified a sentence that could have implied a legal threat. In French, he softened a phrase that sounded arrogant to European ears. In Russian, he rephrased a comment that skirted dangerously close to mockery. By midday, murmurs had shifted from curiosity to quiet admiration. Clara watched it all from the side of the stage. She'd gambled bringing him in, she knew that. Some on her board hadn't trusted her judgment, especially after the Roman Greaves debacle the year before. But as she observed the room, she saw not just understanding, but connection. Deals were being formed that couldn't have happened with cold interpreters reading from scripts. They were listening, because Luca made them feel heard. During the short break before the keynote session, Clara found Luca alone in the backstage corridor sipping from a bottle of water, the knot of his tie slightly loosened. "You're doing better than perfect," she said. He wiped his forehead. "They don't teach this part in any textbook." "No," she said. "They don't teach how to feel when someone's speaking. That's what you do." He shrugged, but there was a gleam in his eye, a pride he didn't try to hide anymore. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There's one more segment I didn't warn you about." He raised an eyebrow. Am I being ambushed? Not exactly. We've invited 3 refugee entrepreneurs, one from Syria, one from Côte d'Ivoire, and one from northern China. They'll be sharing their startup visions in their native languages. It's delicate. Luca nodded, instantly switching gears. Who's translating for them? You are. Live. He paused, simultaneous. She nodded. It's meant to show what global accessibility can really look like. Real voices, real people. No over-editing. His jaw tightened not with fear, but focus. Give me 5 minutes. He pulled out a small black notebook from his blazer. No phone, no tablet. Just pages of handwritten notes and multiple scripts. Clara watched in awe as he murmured syllables under his breath, refining his phrasing, scanning linguistic variants in real time. She suddenly realized something he wasn't performing. He was communing. When the refugee entrepreneurs took the stage, the audience was respectful but skeptical, polished suits uncertain of how to absorb stories that didn't come wrapped in metrics or market forecasts. But then the Syrian woman began, her voice trembling, and Luca, positioned just off stage, microphone in hand, began to speak. His voice was calm, rhythmic, echoing her cadence. He translated her dream of building mobile medical units for war-torn villages with a reverence that turned silence into reverie. When the Ivorian man spoke of building solar-powered internet hubs for rural schools, Luca's voice warmed, his phrasing lifting like sunlight off distant rooftops. And when the Chinese woman explained her plan to recycle textile waste into reusable housing panels, his tone became steady, strong, unwavering, as if her hands were laying bricks through him. The room did not stir. They breathed together. And when the final word was spoken, there was a pause so deep it vibrated in the floor. Then came the applause. Not polite, not corporate, real. Clara stood just behind the curtain, hand over her mouth. She'd known Luca was gifted. But this wasn't just language. This was healing. Later, as guests lingered in the lounge area, networking now energized with a kind of humanity rarely felt in events like this, Clara joined Luca on the rooftop terrace. The city buzzed below, lights flickering like signals in Morse. "I should have warned you," she said. "I'm glad you didn't," he replied. "If I'd known, I might have gotten in my own way." He turned to her. They weren't used to being heard. She nodded slowly. Neither was I. They stood in silence for a while. Then Clara said, almost to herself, "You were meant for more than teaching in classrooms." "I used to think that too," Luca admitted. "Then life corrected me." "Maybe it didn't correct you," she said. "Maybe it just paused you. Until now." Their eyes met. No walls, no translation needed. And for the first time in years, something shifted inside both of them. Not a transaction, not a deal, but something infinitely rarer. Recognition. Rain drizzled down Manhattan's glass skyline like a curtain of tiny silver threads, softening the glow of street lamps and neon signs. Clara tapped her fingers on the steering wheel of her parked car outside Luca's building in the Bronx, her hesitation uncharacteristic. She wasn't someone who waited, but tonight she did. When he stepped out into the evening wearing that same simple coat and carrying Emily's sketchbook under one arm, Clara rolled down the window. "I owe you dinner," she said, keeping it casual. "You free?" Luca tilted his head. "Depends. Are we talking pizza or politics?" "I was thinking something in between." He hesitated. Not because of the offer, but because of everything that came with it. In his world, dinner wasn't just dinner. It was a disruption, a reshuffling of priorities. Emily was with his neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Harris, who adored Emily like her own granddaughter, but time away from home still felt like a risk. Still, he found himself nodding. "Give me 5 minutes." They ended up at a small French-Italian bistro tucked beneath a bookstore in the West Village, one of those hidden gems only locals knew about, with candles on every table and soft jazz playing just loud enough to mask neighboring conversations. Clara had clearly been here before. The maitre d' greeted her by name. Luca raised an eyebrow. "How many secret lives do you lead?" Just two, she said with a half-smile. This one's quieter. They sat by the window rain streaking down the glass in faint, ghost-like trails. The menus were printed in French with tiny English translations. Luca read both versions without blinking. "You surprise me," she said as the waiter took their order. "Why?" "Because I don't fit the profile of someone who speaks 8 languages and still delivers packages for a living." Clara didn't flinch. "No, because most people would have let the world wear them down by now. You're still intact." He leaned back. "That's not entirely true." A pause. The air between them shifted. "You're right," Clara said softly. "I meant you haven't given up." Luca studied her. In the warm candlelight, her features looked less chiseled, more vulnerable. There were shadows under her eyes, tiny tension lines near her mouth. Not fatigue, exactly, more like accumulation. She wore her life like armor, beautifully made, precisely fitted, but heavy. "What about you?" he asked. "What about me? Have you given up?" Clara blinked slowly. "I think I've forgotten what it means not to fight for everything." There it was, the first crack in the granite. She took a sip of wine, then continued. "The company was my father's legacy. When he died, I wasn't ready, but I had to be. The board wanted someone else, but I clawed my way to that chair. And then, once I had it, I realized. The fight had changed me into what she looked at him. Someone who talks a lot but rarely says anything that matters." Luca nodded slowly. "I used to teach linguistics, but more than that, I taught how language shapes thought. You'd be surprised how often people hide behind perfect grammar." Clara chuckled. "Are you accusing me of eloquent avoidance?" He smiled. "Let's call it polished armor." A comfortable silence followed as their food arrived: pasta and sea bass crusty bread, delicate sauces that didn't need words to impress. Halfway through the meal, Clara set down her fork and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how dangerous it is." "Your wife. What happened?" Luca exhaled, not in resistance but readiness. She was a musician, classical cellist, lived off second-hand instruments and pure fire. We met at a language exchange night I used to host. She didn't know a word of Spanish, and I didn't know a thing about music. So we traded. One phrase for one note. Clara smiled. "That's lovely." It was. He paused. "She got sick. Fast. Glioblastoma. The kind of tumor that doesn't ask questions. Emily was born while Megan was in her final month. She never got to hold her. The air stilled. I left the university to care for both of them," Luca added. "Lost tenure, lost savings, but I never lost." Her voice. "Sometimes when Emily laughs, it sounds like Megan waking up." Clara looked down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said gently. "Some people get decades. We got 4 years and a forever." There was reverence in the silence that followed. No pity, just understanding. When they stepped out into the rain later that night, Luca offered her his scarf. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." She took it, and in that moment, simple quiet charged something shifted. Not attraction, though that was there. Not sympathy, though that lingered too. It was recognition. Of two people who had learned how to speak pain fluently and still chose kindness anyway. Back in her apartment high above Central Park, Clara poured herself a glass of water and looked out at the skyline. Lights shimmered like stars drawn too close to the earth. She thought about Luca. Not just what he said, but how he said it. There was a humility to him, yes, but also something stronger. Depth. The kind of man who didn't just speak 8 languages, but who understood silence in all of them. She pulled out her phone, opened her draft notes for the summit recap report, and typed one sentence at the top. "Kindness isn't soft, it's fluent." Then she closed the file and smiled. Somehow she felt more fluent too. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the city sharp and sunlit as if someone had scrubbed down the skyline overnight. Luca stood by the corner deli, a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, rereading the message Clara had sent only minutes before. "Could we meet in person today? I have something important to discuss. It's good, I promise." Her tone was warm, casual, but he'd seen enough layered subtext in 1,000 translated conversations to know something big was coming. By the time he stepped through the revolving glass doors of the Moreau Global Tower, his mind was already sorting through the possibilities. An extension of the contract, maybe. A recommendation. Possibly a public thank you, though he doubted Clara would risk his discomfort like that. But nothing had prepared him for what she actually said. They met in her private office, the skyline glittering behind her like a sea of frozen lights. She offered him tea instead of coffee, which he accepted with quiet curiosity. Then she sat across from him and said, "I'd like to offer you a position." He blinked. "As what head of global communications?" Silence fell like a stone between them. She continued, her voice even, but her eyes watching his every reaction. "You'd oversee translation strategies across all regions, manage cultural engagement teams, and develop real-time response protocols in international crises. You'd be building bridges where most companies still build firewalls." Luca set down the tea without tasting it. "That's a serious job." Clara nodded. "It is, and you're the only person I trust to do it." A long pause. Then he leaned back slightly, his tone calm but firm. "You're offering me an executive role based on 1 week of freelance work. I'm offering it based on everything I've seen in you," she said. "You're not just fluent in language, you're fluent in people. You see them, and you make them want to listen. That's rare, Luca." He stared at her, and then slowly his expression changed. Not to gratitude, but guardedness. "Clara," he said carefully, "what are your board members going to say when they find out you're giving this position to a delivery driver who showed up out of nowhere?" "They'll say, 'I've lost my mind,'" she replied, not flinching. "Then they'll see the results and they'll change their tune. Eventually. And if they don't, I've fought bigger battles." Luca shook his head. This isn't a battle I want to be in. I didn't come here looking to be rescued. I know that. Then why are you doing this?" Her response came softer than he expected. "Because I believe in building things that last. And most of what we build in this world, companies' reputations, platforms, it all crumbles. But what you do, the way you connect people across difference, that endures." Luca stood up, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. I can't just say yes. I have a daughter who needs stability, not boardroom politics. I can't risk dragging her into something unstable again." Clara stood too, but didn't approach. She understood distance. She respected it. "I'm not asking you to say yes today," she said. "Just don't say no out of fear." He looked at her. "I'm not afraid," he said. But they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Later that evening, Luca sat with Emily in the park across from their apartment. She was on the swings, kicking her feet higher, the wind teasing her loose braid. "Guess what, Dad?" she shouted between pushes. "Mrs. Harris says I could be an artist and a scientist if I want." Luca smiled. "She's a wise woman." Emily slowed down, dragging her feet through the wood chips. "You okay?" she asked. "You've got your serious math face on." He chuckled. That obvious, totally. He debated telling her. Then he did. "There's this job, a big one. Something I didn't think I'd ever be offered again." Her eyes lit up. "Like teaching again." "Sort of, but bigger. More responsibility. More time away." Emily tilted her head. "Would you still take me to school?" He hesitated. "I'd try, but maybe not every day." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would it make you happy?" That question hit harder than all the spreadsheets and fears and professional doubts combined. "I don't know yet," he admitted. She jumped off the swing, walked over, and slipped her hand into his. "I think you should do the thing that makes your voice come back." He looked down at her. "What do you mean?" "You talk different when you're doing the translation stuff. Like you're flying inside." "I like that voice." Luca's throat tightened. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Back at the Moreau Tower, Clara stood before the boardroom windows, staring out into the night, replaying the conversation in her head. She'd never seen someone turn away from opportunity with such clarity, such pain. She admired it. She also feared it, because she knew what was coming. Marcus Delacroix, a board member with a smile as sharp as glass, had been circling her decisions ever since the summit. He'd raised subtle concerns in back channels, citing favoritism and unusual hiring protocols. She knew what he was implying. She also knew he had footage taken from a security camera, no doubt, of her and Luca having dinner. He hadn't used it yet, but he would. Still, she had made her decision, not because of sentiment, but because Luca Rivera wasn't a risk. He was the future the company didn't know it needed, and Clara was done leading from fear. So she opened her laptop and wrote a message. To Luca Rivera. Subject, no pressure. But still hope. I meant what I said. Think about the job. Think about what your voice does to people. Not just the words, the way you show up. Whatever your answer is, I'll respect it. But know this, I didn't offer you that role because I felt sorry for you. I offered it because you reminded me who I am when I stopped performing. See. She hit send, and then turned toward the storm she knew was coming. The next morning, Luca stood at the kitchen sink washing Emily's cereal bowl while the radio murmured softly behind him. The email from Clara was still fresh in his inbox and fresher still in his mind. It had taken him by surprise, not because of what she'd said, but because of how it made him feel. Seen, valued, and terrified. He'd spent the last 6 years carefully avoiding anything that felt remotely like ambition. Ambition had cost him before, cost him time with Megan, with Emily, with his own sanity. And yet here it was again, knocking with a gentler voice, a softer hand. But knocking all the same. Emily wandered in, rubbing her eyes. Is there school today? It's Saturday, he said, smiling. You're off the hook. She nodded, then noticed the serious look on his face. Is it the big job again? Still thinking, he said, drying his hands. But yeah. She sat down at the table, swinging her legs. You used to be really good at thinking before Mom got sick. Luca blinked. What do you mean? You thought about big things, she said simply. Now you think about bills and groceries. I think your brain misses the big stuff. He stared at her for a long moment, the clarity of her words slicing through him like light through glass. Downtown, Clara walked into the boardroom like a woman entering a courtroom. The air was unusually tense. Half the board sat with their tablets out, styluses in hand. Marcus Delacroix leaned back in his chair like a man waiting to pounce. Morning, Clara said, sliding into her seat at the head of the table. No one returned the greeting. She didn't flinch. Marcus was the first to speak. I understand you've offered a high-level executive role to an outside consultant without board approval or competitive interview. Clara folded her hands calmly. I've offered a provisional contract for head of global communications to Luca Rivera based on his demonstrated excellence, multilingual fluency, and real-time impact during the summit. Interesting, Marcus replied. Do we vet all summit vendors for C-suite positions now, or just the ones who join you for dinner? The sentence landed like a slap. Clara's spine straightened, but her voice remained cool. Are you accusing me of impropriety? I'm asking whether your decision-making is compromised by emotional involvement. There it was. Clara let a beat pass before replying. Mr. Rivera is a widower with a child. I met him through a public incident where he assisted international tourists. I asked him to consult. He delivered. Better than anyone we've hired in 5 years. Marcus tapped a button on his tablet. The screen at the end of the room lit up with security footage, Clara and Luca stepping out of the bistro, laughing. Him offering her his scarf, her taking it. The room was silent. This, Marcus said, suggests a level of personal engagement that clouds your professional judgment. Clara didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at Marcus. You're grasping. You're using moments of human connection to attack professional competence. That tells me more about your values than mine." Murmurs rippled along the table. One of the older members, a Japanese-American executive named Kenji Watanabe, cleared his throat. "I was at that summit," he said quietly. I heard Rivera translate with clarity and compassion. I watched him bring the room together in a way no one else could. Are we really going to punish someone for showing humanity? Marcus's mouth tightened. Clara didn't press her advantage. She simply said, "If the board wants to vote on rescinding the offer, go ahead. But let the record show that we are prioritizing optics over value, and fear over talent." No one moved. Then Kenji leaned back and said, "I support the hire." One by one, others slowly nodded. Only Marcus remained silent. Luca didn't hear about the confrontation until hours later. It came via a phone call from Clara herself. She sounded exhausted but calm. "You were right," she said, "about what they questioned everything. Your qualifications, my intentions, even our dinner." Luca closed his eyes. "I'm sorry. Don't be." I stood my ground. He didn't say anything. "I meant it, Luca. I didn't offer you that position because I pity you or because I wanted to prove something. I offered it because you changed the way we communicate with each other, with our clients, with ourselves. That's the kind of leadership this company needs." There was a pause on the line. Then she added softly, "But I also understand if it's too much." Luca looked out his window where Emily was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk below. A bright yellow sun. A rocket ship. 2 stick figures holding hands. "No," he said finally. "It's not too much. It's just not simple." "I never said it would be simple," she replied. He smiled. "Then maybe it's worth doing." That night, Emily crawled into bed beside him the way she used to when she was younger. "Can I tell you something?" she whispered. "Always. I think that lady Clara, she makes you different." "How so?" "You don't sound tired when you talk about her." Luca didn't answer right away, but in his chest something softened. Something opened. He didn't know what lay ahead. Politics, pressure, the careful balance of parenting and purpose. But for the first time in years, he felt like the part of him that used to dream the professor, the bridge builder. The man who once loved complexity was waking up. Not to prove anything, not to reclaim what he'd lost, but to build something new. Not just for himself, but for every voice that had ever gone unheard. The stage lights were hot, but Luca hardly noticed. His palms rested on the smooth wood of the lectern as he scanned the silent audience, hundreds of faces from around the world, many of them veterans of boardrooms and government halls now watching with unusual intensity. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to speak for someone who had finally run out of words. Clara stood a few feet away watching him with steady eyes. She had faced the firestorm head-on, confronted the board's distrust, fended off Marcus's thinly veiled accusations, and refused to step away from her decision to back Luca. But the latest board demand came with razor edges. Clara could remain CEO, but only if she publicly addressed the optics of her relationship with Luca. In other words, distance herself. Step back. Disavow the very trust that had changed her. Luca had refused to let her. "I'll go," he told her the night before. "I'll say what needs to be said. You don't owe me your job. You're not the one costing me anything," she'd whispered. "You're the one making it all finally matter." Now, here he was, a single father, a former professor turned courier, a man who had spent the last 6 years speaking only when necessary and never about himself. Until now. He adjusted the mic and began. "My name is Luca Rivera. I'm not an executive. I don't own a tailored resume or a legacy surname. I'm a widower. I'm a father. And for the past several years, I've lived outside the rooms people like this one tend to gather in. But a few weeks ago, I stood at a street corner in Bryant Park and helped a group of tourists find their way using 8 different languages. It wasn't planned. It wasn't heroic. It was human. One of the people watching that moment was Clara Moreau. He paused. I didn't know who she was. She didn't tell me. But she didn't walk past. She saw something most people don't bother to see anymore, not because they're cruel, but because they're too busy chasing louder things. He took a breath. When Clara offered me a role in this company, it wasn't a handout. It was a test. Could someone from outside this machine contribute to something meaningful? Could language become more than compliance or branding, but a bridge between people who have never been truly heard? He looked around the room. I don't speak for power. I speak for understanding. That's all I've ever done. That's all I'll ever do. Then, gently, he reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a worn photo. Megan, holding a newborn Emily, smiling through the last weeks of her life. I learned to speak again when I had to tell my daughter her mother wasn't coming home. And every day since I've spoken a little more because she needs someone who shows up, not someone who hides. He held the photo up. That's what Clara did. She showed up. When she could have stayed silent. When it would have been safer. A pause so deep you could hear the city pulsing behind the glass. Then Luca turned to Clara and said the final line not just for the room, but for her. Truth has no accent. Kindness has no nationality. And leadership when it matters most needs no defense. The silence held for one beat. Then another. Then came the standing ovation. Not polite, not procedural, but powerful. And Clara, who had fought for her position, her company, and her own right to feel, again stood beside Luca and clapped with tears in her eyes. Afterward, the boardroom was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations. Kenji Watanabe was the first to speak. I moved to retain Clara Moreau as CEO with full backing and no stipulations. I second, said another. No one objected. Even Marcus, tight-lipped, offered only a curt nod and left the room. In the hallway outside, Clara found Luca leaning against the wall, exhausted but calm. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he replied, but I needed to. She stepped closer. Do you regret accepting the job? He shook his head. For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Their eyes met. So much had passed between them without needing to be spoken. They were both of them fluent in silence by now. But Clara took a breath and then said, There's one thing I never thanked you for. He raised an eyebrow. What's that? For giving me back my voice. He smiled gently. Funny, he said, because I was just about to thank you for the same thing. That night, Clara joined Luca and Emily for dinner at their apartment. It was nothing fancy mac and cheese, sliced apples, and ginger ale, but it was warm and filled with laughter. Emily showed Clara her chalk drawings, explained the physics of cartoon rocket boosters, and asked how many languages she spoke. Only 3, Clara admitted. Emily beamed. That's okay. Dad says the best language is the one people feel safe in. Clara looked at Luca. I think he's right. Outside, the Bronx lights twinkled like stars trying to speak. Inside, 3 voices so different in shape, age, and path found a rhythm of their own. And somewhere in the stillness, the world seemed a little quieter, a little kinder, and infinitely more understood. The Monday following Luca's speech arrived not with fireworks but with tension so quiet it pulsed like static beneath every breath. Inside, the glass and steel halls of Moreau Global whispers trailed behind open doors. Board members shook hands with guarded smiles. Assistants exchanged glances over emails whose subject lines all started with clarification required. But Clara walked through it all like a woman freshly sharpened. Her heels clicked a calm rhythm across the marble floor as she made her way to the executive conference room where the final discussion regarding Luca's role and her future would take place. Though the standing ovation after Luca's address had stunned many, it hadn't dissolved all dissent. The optics, some still murmured, remained a liability. The room was already half full when she entered. Kenji Watanabe gave her a brief, respectful nod. Marcus Delacroix was seated near the head of the table, sipping from a bone-white coffee cup, unreadable. Let's begin, Clara said, not waiting for pleasantries. Marcus stood. Before we move to any formal vote, I believe there's one matter left unresolved: Luca Rivera's official appointment. While no one questions his performance, the nature of his connection to Clara continues to raise valid governance concerns. Clara didn't flinch. She'd prepared for this. What she hadn't prepared for was Luca himself stepping through the side door unannounced and standing just inside the room. He was calm composed, like a man walking into an exam he'd already passed. "I asked him to join us," Kenji said before anyone could object. "This decision concerns him. He deserves to be present." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara looked at Luca. He gave her the smallest of nods. And then he spoke. "Before you make your decision, I want to be clear I didn't come here looking for power. I didn't ask for this role. And I have no ambition to climb some invisible ladder. What I do want is to build something that matters for this company and the people it touches. That's all." He turned to Clara. "But I also know the cost of compromise, of accepting roles that strip us down to what's politically digestible." She met his gaze, heart tightening. "So I'm offering my resignation from consideration for the executive position," he said to the room. "If my presence causes this company to question the integrity of one of the most principled leaders it has ever had, then I'd rather step back than be used as a reason to push her out." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Clara stood slowly. "You don't get to make that call." "I already did," Luca replied softly. "This was never supposed to be about me." She looked at the board. "If anyone thinks I'm going to let a man walk away because we lack the courage to stand behind what's right, they're mistaken." Marcus broke in. "Miss Moreau, you must understand." "No," she said, her voice like glass meeting steel. "You need to understand. I'm not choosing between him and this job. I'm choosing how I lead. I will not reinforce a system that punishes authenticity and rewards pretense." She turned to the room. "If that disqualifies me in your eyes, then you may vote me out. But know this: if I stay, we move forward on values that actually mean something." A long pause. Then Kenji leaned forward. "I vote we retain Clara Moreau as CEO without condition, and I suggest we reframe this conversation not around optics, but opportunity." Another board member raised a hand. Seconded. One by one, the hands went up. All but Marcus. Then, it's decided, Kenji concluded. Clara remains, and Mr. Rivera's resignation is respectfully declined. We want him on the team on his terms. Marcus stood, gathered his things without a word, and left. Outside the boardroom, the air felt clearer. Clara followed Luca to a quiet corner of the floor near the executive garden terrace, a place a few employees even knew existed. "You were ready to give it up," she said, her voice low. "I wasn't giving up," he replied. "I was choosing peace over position. For me. For Emily." She stepped closer. "But you also knew I'd fight. I was counting on it." They smiled, quiet, tired, full. "Does this mean we're both still standing?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, maybe for the first time. That evening, Luca and Emily returned home to find a small box on their doorstep. Inside was a folded note and a thin tablet device engraved with the Moreau Global logo. "Welcome to the team officially. You'll need this for remote access and for the real work ahead. But first, enjoy this moment. You've earned it." See. Underneath the note was a children's language learning app already logged in under Emily Rivera. When Emily saw her name, she gasped. "Is this mine?" "It is," Luca said, kneeling beside her. "Looks like someone wants you to learn as many languages as me." She grinned. "Can I start tonight?" "You can start whenever you're ready." She ran to the couch, already tapping through the first lesson. Luca leaned back against the doorframe, watching her heart full. He didn't know what the future held. The role would be hard. The scrutiny wouldn't disappear, and neither would the weight of balancing fatherhood with leadership. But, for once, the choice had been his, and he'd made it without compromise. From this point on, he wasn't just translating words. He was translating life, on his terms, with his voice. beside the one woman who'd finally heard it and never once tried to silence it. Spring came quietly to New York City that year. It didn't trumpet its arrival with bold blossoms or radiant skies, but rather slipped in gently through open windows and soft winds that rustled paper on desks and tugged at the sleeves of jackets left intentionally unzipped. For Luca Rivera, it arrived in the form of laughter, children's laughter echoing through the halls of the newly opened Center of Voices. The building itself had once been an abandoned community library in the South Bronx. Now restored with funding from Moreau Global and designed by local architects and educators, it pulsed with purpose. The sign outside bore both English and Spanish, and inside every wall was painted with languages: French greetings, Arabic proverbs, Mandarin characters beside Swahili idioms. Language wasn't a subject here, it was a bridge. At the front desk, a child, no older than 6, held a picture book written in Amharic, pointing excitedly at the illustrations. Nearby, a teenage boy explained Spanish verb conjugations to an older Ukrainian refugee who listened with wide, grateful eyes. And in the far corner, at a round table where sun poured in like a blessing, Emily Rivera was helping a younger girl pronounce the word hope in Italian. Clara stepped inside just as a group of volunteers broke into applause at a successful first lesson. Her heels clicked softly against the tile and she paused for a moment at the doorway, breathing it all in. "You know," she said, turning to Luca, "I wasn't sure this place would feel real until today." He looked around with quiet satisfaction. "It's as real as it gets." "Do you remember," she added, the night after the summit, "you told me you weren't interested in building a legacy. I'm still not," he replied, smiling. "I'm building a life. This just happened to come with it." They walked slowly through the center past classrooms with open doors and laughter that spilled freely between lessons. Each room bore the name of a language, but more importantly, a person. Megan's room was one of them, dedicated to music and expression. "She'd have loved this," Luca said softly, running his hand along the plaque by the door. "All of it." "She's part of it," Clara said. "Always will be." He nodded, grateful. In the small courtyard behind the center, the staff had planted a tree. Just last week, young thin, still learning to stand on its own. Beneath it sat a bench where kids now gathered between sessions, speaking fractured versions of English Tagalog and Farsi to each other with the ease only children can muster. Luca and Clara stood there in silence for a long moment, watching as voices once pushed aside now filled the air with possibility. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't stopped that day in the park?" Clara asked. "All the time," he said, and he turned to her. "Then I remember what Emily said, that I sound different when I use my voice, and I realize I wasn't just finding my voice again. I was finding people who wanted to hear it." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, and the affection in her gaze was no longer hesitant, no longer restrained. "You know what I've learned from all of this," she said. "What that leadership is just another form of translation. It's taking chaos, fear, and pressure and choosing every day to interpret it through kindness." Luca's smile deepened. "So we're both translators now?" "Always have been," their hands brushed, then intertwined. Later that evening, long after the center had closed for the day, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of their apartment showing Clara her newest drawing. It was a mural for the courtyard wall, a row of children holding paper megaphones, but instead of shouting, they were releasing birds. Doves, swallows, cardinals, each feather marked with a word belonging home, truth, joy. "Do you like it?" she asked, eyes wide. Clara nodded, swallowing the sudden lump in her throat. "It's perfect." Emily beamed and turned back to her crayons. Luca stood by the window watching them, a warm light cast across his face. His home, once quiet, now felt filled overflowing, really not just with people, but with meaning. The kind he'd stopped believing he could still find. Outside, dusk wrapped the city in gold. Horns honked far off. A saxophone played somewhere nearby. But here, in this small apartment in a tall, indifferent city, a family was finding harmony. Not by chance, by choice. 6 months later, Luca stood once again on a small stage, this time not in a corporate hall, but in the heart of the Bronx beneath string lights and summer stars as the Center of Voices celebrated its first graduating class of multilingual youth mentors. He looked out at the crowd, students, parents, teachers, neighbors. And when he spoke, he didn't need to prepare notes. He simply said, "Language is not just how we speak. It's how we show someone they matter. It's the space we make for another person's story. And sometimes when the world grows loud or cruel or unkind, the greatest thing we can do is speak softly and still be heard. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for helping me find my voice again. And thank you for choosing to use yours." The audience rose in applause. And as Clara stepped forward beside him, her hand slipping into his, the night carried their joined silhouettes across the faces of those who'd come, many of them once voiceless. But not anymore. Never again. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let us know what part of the story touched you most. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspirational tales just like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and stay connected.